All right, biology students. And here in Exploration 4, we're going to discuss how the cell membrane is structured and how it functions. For your assignment for this part here, you'll have two options, either to make a stop animation video to demonstrate some of these things, or you can make an actual physical model of the cell membrane. You have the choice. So one of the most important functions of the cell is to maintain homeostasis, as we've learned before, right? So in order to do that, the cell has to get stuff into and out of the cell. And it does so by manipulating what's called the cell membrane, or in some cases, we call it the plasma membrane. It has some specialized structures that allow the cell to control the passage of materials into and out of the cell. Now, different types of carbon-based molecules, including lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates, make up the cell membrane, right, which we saw in a previous lesson. But once again, here is the hands-on activity. This is a worksheet here that I posted on the Schoology page where you can use this as a framework to give you some suggestions of how to make the model of the cell membrane. Let's review from last class. How is the cell membrane set up? It is a what we call a phospholipid, right? It has two phospholipid layers, one on the bottom, one on the top here. And so the head likes water and the tails don't like the water. We had terms for that: hydrophobic and hydrophilic. Okay, and so that makes the vast majority of the cell membrane. Now, in these cell membranes, you have protein channels, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes. These are how large molecules get into and out of the cell. And you have carbohydrate chains and protein attached throughout the cell membrane. Now, these carbohydrate chains are really important. They perform a very important function. There's a video that I'm going to post here about how COVID-19 is able to manipulate these carbohydrate chains in order to get into the cells. These protein chains receptors on the cell membrane are a type of receptors that are able to let certain things into and out of the cell. So underneath this, you have cytoskeleton proteins. This is to help give it some rigidity and some structure, but at the same time maintain its flexibility. Okay, so if you're going to make the model of this particular cell membrane, you need to include all of these things in your model. Okay, so moving on, the cell membrane needs multiple pathways for substances to enter and exit the cell. So some very important things that need to get into the cell, if you can remember, things like oxygen, right? Water. You have different types of nutrients. These are all really important. So also things that need to get out of the cell are carbon dioxide, excess water, different waste components. These sort of things, they need to get out of the cell. Because remember, homeostasis, it needs to maintain a proper balance. So the cell membrane, like we said, has multiple passageways for substance to enter and exit the cell. This task is accomplished by proteins, right? So these proteins embedded into the phospholipid layer transport material across the membrane. And others, in the form of enzymes, they speed up the chemical reactions that take place in the membrane. Still others act as receptors for specific molecules such as hormones, right? This is a really important concept here. Like the hormone adrenaline, for instance, right? Adrenaline only gets into the cells if it has adrenaline receptors on the cell. So things, certain types of cells like the ones in your heart and the ones in your muscles, right? And the ones in your lungs, these types of cells have receptor sites for adrenaline. When adrenaline is released, it can only go into those particular types of cells. So it's very specialized. So these carbohydrate receptor sites also function as identification tags. This is really important too. Everybody has specific types of receptor sites, right? Like the same thing, like when you have a person who gets an organ transplant, right? One of the biggest factors that contributes to whether or not that person's body is able to accept or reject that organ is if it has receptors that are similar to the donor body. So these identification tags, you can think of them like jerseys on sports teams. They identify whose team you're on, so to speak. And so if your immune system recognizes these identification tags as well, and if they do not recognize it, they identify it as a foreign body or a pathogen, and then they try to attack and kill it. Okay. And so this is a really interesting whole caveat of biology, because like autoimmune diseases, cell organ transplants, they all have to do with these cell membrane receptor sites. So more on that to come. All right, so moving on here. So cholesterol is an important factor in the cell membrane, right? Making up the phospholipid. Cholesterols are essential for the body to have. Usually a person can make their own cholesterol based on the different types of foods that they eat. However, as we all know, if you have too much cholesterol, this can be bad for you and cause heart disease. So you have to find a nice balance. Here in Central Asia, you do have people with high cholesterol contents in their blood, usually because of the high meat content of their diets. So cholesterol is really important, but too much of it can be a bad thing. All right, so the structure of the cell membrane gives it selective permeability. Selective meaning certain things can come in. Permeability means the actual ability for things to come in and out. So what that means is it's very selective. It only allows certain things in and certain things out. Okay. So in order to be selective, it has to have some mechanism in there to help identify these things. So molecules and other materials such that cross the membrane in several ways. Some of these methods require energy and others do not. This is like the most important concept here in this section here that we're going to be focusing on. Certain things do not require energy and certain things do. Okay, so how much of a particular molecule crosses the membrane depends on the molecule's size, right? The polarity and the concentration inside versus outside. So these are some really important sentences here. So you guys need to like really focus on these. Remember these. These are going to come up several times here. All right, so the first type of transport is what we call passive transport. Now the word passive means basically it happens without energy. So there's a lot of different substances that can passively transport across the cell membrane. Okay, such as your oxygen, such as some types of fluids. Okay, so the essential thing you need to understand here is that it works based on the concept of diffusion. Okay, higher concentration to lower concentration. This is the way passive transport works. When you have a high concentration of, let's say these are water molecules over here, and you have a low concentration over here, the natural movement of these is to go from high to low. So these things are able to pass right through the cell membrane. Okay. Now, regular diffusion does not require the protein channels in order to move things. It happens directly on the cell membrane. without these specialized pathways. Okay, facilitated diffusion works from higher concentration to lower concentration as well. However, these molecules have to pass through these, shall we say, specialized areas of these protein channels. You can think of this like if you're crossing the border, you have to go through the passport exchange, so to speak. That's the only place that you're legally allowed to travel through. And so these protein channels act as those functions. Okay, so they're able to go through here without any use of energy. All right, but they have to go through a specific place. Okay, so pay real close attention to that in your model. So speaking of model, I forgot to mention this is the second part of the um, assignment here, making a stop animation of this process. Diffusion works in a very specific way. It's the movement of molecules or in a fluid or a gas from a higher concentration to a low concentration. And so you think about this like when you spray air freshener in a room, right? It disperses and is able to fill up that space that you spray it in, and so it just moves throughout the air, and the molecules disperse kind of randomly, and it moves from high concentration to low concentration. We call this the concentration gradient. Okay, so it usually moves from high to low. So air is a great example of things that move through diffusion. Okay. Some molecules cannot simply diffuse across the membrane. They got to be facilitated. Like I said, they got to go through these certain transport proteins. So you can read through that here. All right. These are good animations. You want to watch these and see how these work on your own. Okay. Osmosis is another type of diffusion, but it's specifically related to water molecules. Okay. And so this is really important concepts here. I'm going to let you guys read through this, but it's basically diffusion with water molecules. And as we know, water is an essential part of the living organisms. So this is a really important function here. We were going to do a lab on this if we were in class. I still may try to do something with it, maybe film it, but nonetheless, you have a semi-permeable membrane and it has little holes in it. When you have high concentration, it can move to the low concentration through those little pores, as they're called. Now, active transport is different than passive because it requires energy in order to move the molecules. Okay, this is a really important concept. So, like I said, the big difference is they got to have energy in order to move these substances across the membrane. And so the energy that is used to do that is called ATP. Okay, I'm going to make another video to go over this, what exactly ATP is for you. But essentially what it is, it's the form of energy that's actually used by the cell. When the glucose molecule is broken down further, it is used to make ATP. And this ATP is the, shall we say, these are the molecules that act like batteries that transport and store energy for cellular uses. So here's a video here. Please watch over this to see how this works. Let's see. One other thing I need to point out here too is that active transport can go against the concentration gradient. Now remember, over here we learned about the concentration gradient, right? High concentration to low concentration. This is how it naturally can move. It can move opposite of this direction. It can move from low concentration to high concentration, but in order to do that, it has to have energy. It has to be forced across this membrane with the help of some type of molecules and with the help of some ATP energy source. Okay, so please watch that video. You can use this. You guys can do that. Last but not least, you have endocytosis here and exocytosis. So endocytosis is the process where very large molecules move across the cell membrane using what's called vesicles. Now, vesicles sounds like the word vehicle, right? Very similar concept. But endocytosis, they make the cell membrane, as you can see, you have a large molecule here. It wants to come inside of the cell membrane. So what happens is the cell membrane kind of forms around it and then encloses it entirely. And the cell membrane then reattaches here. Okay. Once that substance is inside, that vesicle moves it to different parts of the cell for specific functions. And once that happens, the cell membrane around that makes up the vesicle is then dissolved, and then that particle can be broken down into smaller things. So some molecules or some proteins are very large, and this is the only way they can come in, through endocytosis. Okay, in the animation, there's one of the options there you can make to show this process too. Okay, you read more about that. Exocytosis is just the opposite. Sometimes you have large amounts of stuff in the cell that needs to be expelled from the cell. So remember, the vesicles, membrane, and the cell membrane are made up of the same stuff. So therefore, inside, like the Golgi apparatus, or usually is where this happens, and they package some proteins or whatever that need to be put outside, or some hormones that need to be injected out of the cell membrane to be used in a different place. This is how it works. So they are encircled here, and they come up here and they fuse right here. This is a part of the animation that you're going to pay real close attention to, is how this fuses together, and then it expels it here and becomes, the actual vesicle becomes a part of the cell membrane. So this process works in a lot of other organisms too, like white blood cells, for instance, do this. Other types of cellular organisms do this as well. So this is a really important concept that we'll come back to in the future. Okay, so that's it for this section. Good luck on your animation or your model making. So have fun with that.